This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Hello and welcome to our latest episode of This is Democracy. I'm Zachary Suri. We're joined, of course, as always, by Professor Jeremi Suri. Good morning.
Good morning, Zachary.
And today we have the privilege of speaking with someone who is an expert and someone with a personal connection to an issue that's been in the news of late, something that has been on the minds of not just political observers around the world, the sort of politicos of the world, but also on the minds of American political leaders as well, who also have, at least some of them, a particular personal connection to this topic. We're speaking, of course, about the recent elections in Hungary that saw the long-awaited fall of Viktor Orbán, the longest-serving prime minister in Europe, and one who's often been accused of authoritarian tendencies. Today, joining us to speak about this important issue is Lorinc Redei. Lorinc Redei is the Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Education and an Associate Professor of Instruction at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is from Hungary, and he is also an expert on the politics of that country, on policymaking in Europe, democratic backsliding, and international relations more broadly. Professor Redei, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, I think the first question that has to be asked, we're talking about the politics of a country that's relatively small. Why was Viktor Orbán so high profile in the world, and how did he become such a favorite of the global right and the American right in particular?
That's a great question, and I think it's the right one to start with. If you think about the fact that Hungary is a small landlocked country with fewer than 10 million people, people really shouldn't know Viktor Orbán's name. There's no good reason to. If I asked you who's the prime minister of Slovenia, I don't think you'd be able to say. Whereas Viktor Orbán has been in the global conversation about democracy, democratic backsliding, and what he has called illiberal democracy for over a decade and a half. And there are several reasons for that. I think the first one is that Viktor Orbán was a front runner in this process of what Kim-Lane Shepele at Princeton has called autocratic legalism, which is this idea that you have a democratically elected government that slowly but surely and very methodically and incrementally gets rid of the checks and balances against executive power via legal means. And he has been doing this for over 15 years. And so he was kind of the first to do it, and also one of the smartest leaders to do it. So he's become a model for a lot of other populist authoritarian leaders who wish to follow in his footsteps. So if you look at the policies and political strategies of whether it's Jair Bolsonaro or Javier Milei, or even in some respects Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, or indeed of the Trump administration, you see echoes of and sort of copycat versions of what he was doing. So he's been doing this for a very long time. And then second, he's also very actively sought this role of being the leader of this movement of right-wing populist leaders who want to dismantle what they see as unjust and unreasonable shackles on their own power. And so if you think about his presence, even in U.S. politics, for instance, he's spoken multiple times at the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is basically the American conservatives' yearly convention to talk about what their party's platform is going to be. He is the only foreign leader who was named in Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's presidential debate, where Donald Trump brought him up, right? So he has an outsized weight, and he's a symbol of this illiberal democracy worldwide.
Fascinating. Could you maybe also give us a sense of where his politics come from on a more sort of personal level, I understand that at least soon after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of communist rule in Hungary, Orbán was seen as a liberalizing figure.
Absolutely. I mean, his party is called Fidesz, which is an acronym of Fiatal Demokraták Szövetsége, which basically means an alliance of young Democrats. And in 1989, Orbán was a very young university student, very strident liberal. His party was made up very strongly of university students who wanted free elections, who wanted the Russians to leave Hungary after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So his roots are very much in this liberal politics. And over the next few decades, his politics have shifted. He's become much more conservative. He's become much more nationalist. And he's basically turned his back on a lot of liberal principles and a lot of progressive principles that he used to hold. And so one of the things that I think is important to remember about him is that, especially even in the past decade or so that he's been in power, he and his party have actually been quite flexible when it comes to ideology and policy positions. What they have been not flexible about is making sure that their electoral success and their power in government should not be questioned and should be very, very hard to dislodge. So, in some ways they're very pro-market. In other ways, they have, for instance, argued for controlling the prices of basic goods like bread and milk and gasoline and things like that. In some ways, they are sort of, open to the European Union and to Western ideas, and sometimes with the other breath, they decry the influence of Brussels and of global liberal elites in Hungary. So ideologically, there's not a real through line. The populism and the autocratizing are really the stable parts of the platform of both him and his party, Fidesz.
So then, Lawrence, how did it go wrong for him in this election? I mean, you've described someone who's a very savvy, skilled shapeshifter and able to hold on to power and manufacture authoritarian control over a society and authoritarian influence broadly without ideological consistency, but as you said, with an autocratic consistency. How did he lose control of things?
So there's two sides of that, I think. One is what went wrong for him, and the other is what went right for the opposition. So let me start with the first one, for what went wrong for Viktor Orbán. There's a couple of things here. So the first is we need to remember that Viktor Orbán and Hungary for the past 15 years has been a system that political scientists call it competitive authoritarianism, which means that it's authoritarian, but crucially, it's also still competitive. Elections are still competitive. Parties can enter the political arena, and while the playing field is tilted against them, these elections still can bring about a result where the government loses, which is what happened 10 days ago. So the institutions allowed for this kind of loss. It's just a question of why it happened. So in terms of why Orbán lost some of his control over Hungarian politics, I think there's a few reasons. The first is simple fatigue. Orbán has been in power for 16 years. So there are voters who were 2 years old the last time that there was a different prime minister in power. And so at a certain point, in our current political and just general culture where novelty is very important, people just got tired of him. The second thing is that the message that the government had in this campaign was a continuation of a very fear-based rhetoric that Fidesz had adopted in the past decade and a half. And there was always a different object for whom the Hungarian people should be afraid of. During the migration crisis in 2015, it was Syrian refugees. Then it was the philanthropist George Soros with his sort of corrupt ideas. Then it was Brussels who was trying to push EU policies down Hungarians' throats without consulting them. Then it was the LGBT community that was somehow trying to ruin Hungary's children. And then recently it was Ukraine, which was trying to drag Hungary into a war that it didn't want to participate in. And the trick with this is that fear works if you can drum up this fear-based rhetoric and if there's real danger. But at the end of the day, none of these were actually real threats to Hungarian society. There are actually very few migrants who ended up wanting to stay in Hungary. There is no attempt by Brussels to force its way onto Hungarian social rules, and even when there's a Hungary participates in those decision-making processes. The Ukraine war is now 2 years old, and there's still no real fear among anybody or among the majority of the population in Hungary of being drafted and being sent to fight in a war against Russia. And so I think there was just this fatigue with the fear as well. So I think those things mattered. And then finally, after 16 years in government, it's also very hard for anybody in power to run from his or her record. Once you've been in power for 16 years, and remember too, Orbán had a 2/3 majority in parliament, meaning a supermajority in parliament for this entire time, which means he could literally pass any law that he wanted without consulting the opposition. He could amend the constitution if he wanted without consulting the opposition. So he had all of the levers of power at his disposal. So whatever is kind of wrong with the country, it's very hard to make an argument that it's other people's fault if you've been in charge for 16 years. And because the economic situation in Hungary has not been great for the past few years, with high inflation and poor state of public services and dilapidated hospitals and not enough money spent on education, these things started to be real liabilities for the government.
Got it.
That makes sense. Who is Péter Magyar, this sort of opposition leader who is now on track to be prime minister, and how different is he from Orbán in his politics, or is he just a new face?
I mean, I think this is the big question. So Péter Magyar, the incoming presumed prime minister, was actually very much associated with Fidesz. He was a Fidesz party member. He was part of Orbán's regime. He led a bunch of state-led enterprises and was part of this relatively, corrupt scheme of, keeping a lot of economic actors tied to the government's interests. His ex-wife was the Minister of Justice, so he was very much in the inner circles of the Fidesz family. And it was only 2 years ago that he broke with Fidesz and started to expose a lot of its corruption from the inside, using a lot of his inside knowledge. And what's important to remember is that in some ways, Péter Magyar is quite similar to Orbán. He is quite aggressive in his tone when you hear him speak. He's a nationalist. He is conservative. He isn't, I think, a loud standard bearer for pluralist democracy. But at the same time, he has managed to become the face of a united opposition against Orbán by insisting that what he's going to do is not just become the new face of an authoritarian government, but rather to dismantle this system of both corruption and of executive overreach that Orbán had built over the past few years. And so he's an interesting figure, and I think he was uniquely placed to be able to unite the opposition against Fidesz, which is why he managed to pull off this feat of not only unseating Viktor Orbán, but of getting a 2/3 supermajority in the parliament himself, which gives him the tools to potentially undo some of these legal moves that had been accruing over the past decade and a half.
Lawrence, what protection is there against Magyar just becoming another Orbán?
I think this is the central question of the next 2-3 years. If you look at the composition of the Hungarian parliament as it's going to take office in the next few weeks. You have 3 parties in the parliament, which is already fewer parties than most European democracies have. One party is Péter Magyar's TISA party, which is basically a center-right conservative party that hopefully stands for principles of liberal democracy. You have a more far-right party in Fidesz that still, won over a third of the vote and is going to be represented in the parliament. And then you have the real far-right, the true fascists. Mm. So if you think about it, I can't think of another example of a consolidated democracy having 3 parties in parliament that are all significantly to the right of center. There's not a single person in the parliament who is a liberal, who is a green, who is a leftist, who's a socialist, who's a communist, any other of those flavors of politics.
Not a single one, Lawrence?
Not a single one.
Wow.
And so interestingly, there's not going to be very much institutional constraints from within the parliament to keep Péter Magyar honest. Where I do think that you have a lot of constraints is the actual population and civil society, because there's a very, very large portion of those people who voted for the TISA party who did not vote for that party because they thought this party represented their interests or represented their political ideologies, but because they saw this as the last hope to get rid of the Orbán regime. And so what's going to be really interesting is how are these people, and these are represented by civil society organizations, by volunteers, or simply just as voting citizens, how are their views going to be taken account by this new government that can't really afford to lose all of these voters? And I actually am not sure how that's going to happen, but I think it's one of the fundamental challenges facing this new government is to make sure that it really does represent that really, really broad consensus that brought them to power, but that is not actually represented formally in the parliament itself.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. I want to ask about a different issue, which I think for many American voters, at least, who are used to hearing Orbán's regime as described as authoritarian, the sort of transfer of power that we've seen and his quick admission of defeat was somewhat surprising. Why do you think it was that Orbán embraced this sort of peaceful transfer of power so readily, or has he? And maybe it's a false impression.
No, he has. And I think that's a really important point to make. I will out myself that I'm not a huge supporter of Viktor Orbán and his regime. Maybe that's not a huge surprise. But what I will say is that Orbán has never in his tenure resorted to violence. So unlike the Putin regime, where if you criticize the regime, you might find that it's very slippery on the 5th floor of a hotel and you fall out of the window, or you find uranium in your underpants, or you get poisoned, right? Like that does not happen in Hungary. And similarly, there has never been a protest against the government, and there have been a lot of protests that has been put down violently. I think Orbán legitimately does have some personal and philosophical limits to how far he's willing to go, and I can't see him really using violence to hang on to power. This was made this was reinforced, I should say, by the fact that in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, members of the armed forces, the police forces, and the Secret Service all came forward basically saying that the Orbán regime has overly politicized these institutions and they've had enough of it, which also created this, I think, doubt in anybody who would have even been tempted to use violence to hold on to power, of whether those institutions that wield force, actual force in society, would actually follow orders to keep this regime in power. I was a tiny bit surprised also at how early Orbán conceded, because only about 30% of the results had been in when he called Péter Magyar to concede defeat. But I also think he knew that the writing was on the wall. I don't think he was surprised by the result. I think he knew a few days before that this is what was going to happen. So I wasn't that surprised by it. I think if the vote had been much closer, then we may have seen a situation where there's allegations of impropriety and of the votes being counted incorrectly or election fraud being leveled. But because the margin of victory for Péter Magyar's Tisza party was so large, I think that was just not a viable option either.
Yeah, to me, Lawrence, that was what was really striking, was not that Orbán lost, but that he lost so big, even beyond what the polls were predicting, with such high turnout, right, with close to 80% of Hungarians coming out to vote against Orbán. Is this the end of Orbán? Is this the beginning of a new trend away from the right in Europe, or is this specific to Hungary? How do you see this? You're a scholar of the wider European continent, so how do you see it in that context?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions in there. So the first thing I think that's interesting is that the polls were actually exactly right. So the independent polling that had been following what the support for each party was, I think they were so accurate that people were actually very, very surprised. The pro-government think tanks that were trying to show polling numbers that was essentially propaganda, it was shown that their polling was terrible. So it's really interesting that polling was actually incredibly accurate in predicting the result. It's just many people, even when they saw the polls, they didn't believe them because they said that can't be right. In terms of the magnitude of the victory, I think you're right that the turnout was quite high. It was 78%, which is the largest turnout that Hungary has had in any of its free elections since 1989. And what that also means is that you've had a lot of new voters who came to the polls, which essentially means predominantly young people who haven't had a chance to vote before. And that certainly helped the Tisza party gain its majority. If you look at what is the best determinant of whether you are a supporter of Tisza or of Orbán's Fidesz party, the younger you are, the more likely it is that you're going to vote for Tisza. The more educated you are, the more likely it is that you're going to vote for Tisza. And the larger the town or city that you live in, the more likely it is that you're going to vote for Tisza. And these are all kind of linear correlations, right? So he managed to assemble this quite large majority. And in terms of what happens to Orbán, which is the second question, this is really tricky because in any other, I would say, normal democratic system, if you have a party that underperforms this much compared to the last election, the automatic thing that would happen is that the leader of that party would resign on election night. That has not happened. Orbán has not resigned. And so this is interesting because I think Fidesz faces a particularly tough dilemma here. What I think people need to understand is that Fidesz by now is not a traditional European party. In some ways, it's much closer to what the Republican Party is in the U.S. today, which is that it's a party extremely focused on one personality, the leader at the top. It's almost like a personality cult for Viktor Orbán. And so many of its voters vote for Fidesz not because they really have any deep connection to the party's priorities or its policies, but rather because they're big fans of Viktor Orbán. And so if Orbán resigns, some of those people might leave the party, and the party might suffer more electorally. On the other hand, if he stays, then he's the face of this previous electoral defeat, and there are a lot of people in the party now who are going to be at each other's throats. There's fewer resources in order to buy the loyalty of different party members and economic actors who are aligned with the party. So there's a smaller pie to fight over, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on of who's to blame for this electoral defeat. And so if Orbán stays, then you have this party that has been proven to be a party that loses, stay in. If Orbán stays in power, then that doesn't change. So either way, I think the Fidesz party is going to lose more supporters. And this is what's really interesting, is that polling organizations have continued to actually do polling even after the elections, which I think is a little bit unusual, to see whom people support. And the support of the TISA party has grown exponentially since the election.
Wow.
So now it has the support of 66% of the population, which is insane. Like that's a really high threshold.
Yeah.
And so I think, no matter what, the Fidesz and Viktor Orbán are going to get weaker within Hungarian politics. And I don't really see a way for Orbán to kind of revive himself and come back like a phoenix risen from the ashes and take back power. I actually don't think that's very, very likely. In terms of what it means for the region, which is the third question you asked, right? I think it's a little bit too early to say this is the sort of beginning of the end for right-wing forces. We just had elections in Bulgaria where a relatively pro-Russian candidate won. He's not, in other ways, he's not autocratic, so it's not an exact analogy, right? But there's plenty of right-wing, autocratic-leaning elected leaders in Europe and in Eastern Europe who are still going strong. What I think is true is that their intellectual leader is now discredited. And I don't really see anybody taking up that mantle of being the global face of this far-right illiberalism. So in that sense, I think it's going to be weakened. But the other thing that is important here is a lot is going to depend on how Péter Magyar is able to undo some of those autocratizing steps that have taken place over the past 15 years, because here there's a lot of dilemmas about how you go about doing that without basically using the same illiberal tools that got us here in the first place. And Poland went through this a few years ago where they're still grappling with this problem, but we can talk about that more later if you wish.
That makes sense. As we begin to close up, I do want to ask what you feel like the lessons from Hungary are for countries and populations that are facing similar efforts to entrench the kind of democratic illiberalism that Orbán championed. Do you think these elections offer a sort of roadmap for how to defeat or counter that kind of politics, or is it more complicated?
I wouldn't phrase these as hard and fast rules, but I think there are some lessons that we can learn. I think the first lesson is that as long as the system in which we are operating is still a competitive authoritarian system rather than an actual dictatorship, there is always a chance to vote the bums out. You just have to have enough people go to the polls and vote these people out. The second lesson is about how do you get enough people to do that? And I think there's a couple of lessons here. I think the first is that you require a very united opposition. One of the things that has happened under this TISA party, which is quite striking, is that the TISA party in 2026 got 1.4 million more votes than the united opposition did in 2022. In 2022, there was also this attempt to create a united opposition against Orbán. And it gathered some votes, obviously, but not enough to change the outcome. TISA got 1.4 million more votes. That's a lot when you're thinking about the total number of eligible voters is 8 million in Hungary. And what's interesting about that is that of these 1.4 million voters that it got in excess of the united opposition from the previous election, 500,000 came from Fidesz. But over 1 million came from either existing opposition parties or from new voters. So what actually happened is you basically had an election where it was almost a two-party race, which is not usual in a parliamentary system in a European democracy. Usually you have a bunch of parties. And as I was mentioning earlier, only 3 parties ended up making it into parliament. So every single party that wasn't the super far right and that was opposed to Orbán, they got less than 2% of the total vote. So what that shows you is that basically everybody who was opposed to Orbán got in line behind Tisza. And even if they didn't like their conservative views or didn't particularly like Péter Magyar as a candidate, they said, okay, the first priority is to make sure that this Orbán regime is removed from power. And so there's a lesson there about, how you approach voting, and can you convince people to be strategic voters where they're going to vote for a candidate whom they might not even like very much, but who seems to be, better than the alternative? Can you unite the opposition around somebody? And then the last lesson is maybe about the personality of Péter Magyar himself, in the sense of what kind of person can potentially do this? What kind of person can potentially unite the opposition like that? And I think one of his strengths was that he was coming from within the Fidesz regime, so he knew exactly how they were going to respond. So he was always one step ahead of them. But I think what was more important is that he actually wasn't a high-profile politician in Fidesz before this. Had he been really associated with that regime, a lot of people would not have been able to hold their noses and vote for him. He was low enough on the totem pole in Fidesz that people didn't really hold that against him. And so finding somebody like that, or somebody who is outside of politics, so not affiliated with any of the failed opposition parties, but also not affiliated with the current ruling party, those kinds of people have a larger ability to unite voters around them for the simple reason of just getting rid of the wannabe autocrat. And so that might hold some lessons in terms of where to look for candidates who can do that. It's probably not going to be in established political parties, but outsiders or celebrities or athletes or cultural icons or public intellectuals, or somebody who can really claim to be an outsider and who isn't associated with the sins of either an autocratic government or an inept opposition.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this sort of wonderful summary, but also, I think, important analysis of the biggest lessons and takeaways from an election that got a lot of attention, but I think has quickly faded from the radar of most Americans and policy wonks around the world. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few months in Hungary, but certainly the fall of the Orbán regime and the victory of the opposition seems to offer, at least as you outlined, a kind of path forward for a lot of other countries with similar politics in our moment. Thank you so much, Dr. Redei, for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
And for Professor Suri as well, thank you.
Thank you, Zachary, and thank you, Lawrence.
And thank you most of all to our wonderful listeners for joining us for this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Scott Holmes.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
See you next time.